music going, or is that? All right. Just checking, as they say. Just checking. All right. I'm delighted to see all of you here today for what we think is a very important announcement. An important announcement not just for our industry, but really for our country. And I want to start, if I could, with just a few introductions, because before you see the true leadership of the industry, both aerospace and defense. To my right, we have Jim Albaugh, the CEO of Boeing Commercial Airplanes. He's also chairman of the Aerospace Industries Association, AIA. And further to the right, we have David Hess, CEO of Pratt & Whitney and the vice chair of AIA. On my left are three more members of AIA that I should say are very active and involved and really characterize the mid-sized companies within our industry. Chuck Gray, Vice President and COO of Frontier Electronic Systems. Dawne Hickton, the President and CEO of RTI International Metals. And Rick McNeel, who is the President and CEO of Lord Corporation. I'm grateful to them and to so many members of AIA, including some that we have here in the audience today, for joining us for what, as I say, is an important announcement. We'll share a few remarks with you and then, of course, take questions. Those of you familiar with AIA, of course, know that our primary mission is to serve our membership by closely monitoring policy, regulatory, and legislative issues. And working closely with our members, AIA serves as the voice for aerospace and defense in reaction to these kinds of issues. You'll find more information on AIA and our member companies in today's press packet and, of course, online on our website. I don't hesitate to say that today's announcement represents one of the most important actions in the history of the Aerospace Industries Association, a 92-year-old trade association. Because everyone knows this is a very challenging time for America and for our industry. A national debt threatens to overwhelm all other priorities. We saw no net jobs gain in August, despite the costly stimulus efforts over the past several years. And unemployment remains at over 9%. Economically, Russia, China are competing with us in every market and on the world stage. We're still fighting two wars, Iraq, Afghanistan, and now in countries such as Libya and Yemen, new and very unique risks are emerging, risks to our national security and that of our allies. Threats from nuclear-capable regimes such as North Korea continue daily. Everyone sees that this is an increasingly dangerous world. And European nations, others such as China, are also investing heavily in space-related R&D. And these investments have already led to advances that are leaving American companies at a dangerous competitive disadvantage. As the U.S. industry begins to lag behind in space, in the commercial market, the government, of course, also has needs. New satellite technologies, weather technologies, essential to our war on terror and to the economy of our country as we go into tough weather-related circumstances. But we know that where we are, the country will suffer from our industry's increasing inability to invest in R&D. And this continuing failure to invest in critical infrastructure programs is also costing us dearly. Our aging air traffic control system really has put America at a great economic disadvantage while delaying what are very clear environmental and safety benefits that the rest of the world is rushing to embrace in terms of their air transportation infrastructure. Despite the economic and financial security risks that we're facing, already this Congress has cut over $350 billion from the defense budget, which when you add that to the existing previous cuts already on the table, we're talking about $460 to $480 billion worth of cuts from the defense budget. That is simply more than we can sustain. And an additional $600 billion cut to defense is one of the options that comes with the trigger of the sequester mechanism that the Super Committee will be considering. Even after the death of Osama bin Laden, the threat of terrorism remains. And as an industry responsible for both supplying the warfighter and contributing significantly to the health of our economy, we believe it's our duty now to speak out. This is the rationale behind this national launch today of the Second to None campaign. Naturally, we have a logo. Can't have a campaign without a logo. And hopefully, you'll see it right here behind me. We also have it emblazoned on a few other spots. But fancy logos really aren't the point here. The campaign does not intend to be your typical glitzy, high-out advertising, short on substance, short-term, inside-the-beltway blitz that you often see that is often followed by a deafening silence after one piece of legislation or another is finalized. It's not that kind of short-term endeavor. This is going to be a sustained effort in states, in cities, towns, as well as in Washington, to caution the American people and our leaders of the risk associated with cutting the defense budget further, and of the risk imposed in other areas of significant cuts. We're talking about NASA and our space leadership, and the FAA and the vital role it plays in the next generation air transportation system. Let me focus for just a second on some specific economic risk. The aerospace and defense industry supports 2.9 million American jobs across all 50 states. Over 1 million of these jobs are direct industry jobs, and this is according to a brand new set of data that is coming out of Deloitte Touche. Make no mistake, combining the cuts that have already occurred and the potential for more defense cuts, hundreds of thousands of American workers' jobs are at risk. Our message for the administration and the Congress is slow down. Take a very long look at the national security risk, as they have been noted by everyone from the Defense Department Secretary Panetta, who said they're devastating if they go into place, to General Petraeus, who certainly has reason to know. And that's on top of many other national security experts. And consider, we ask the Congress and our leadership in the White House, consider whether eliminating hundreds of thousands of jobs over the next decade is at all consistent with the national imperative to create jobs. It just doesn't make any sense. I mentioned Secretary Panetta. Some of you are aware that I, along with AIA's Executive Committee and a number of other of our CEOs, met with the Secretary yesterday. It was a very good meeting. And I have to say, there's no question of the Secretary's commitment to have an ongoing dialogue with industry as we work through these tough budget challenges. Secretary Panetta expressed a very clear focus on protecting the U.S. defense industrial base. For both economic and national security reasons, he felt this is important. We have a very fragile industry. It is not the industry that Eisenhower referred to many years ago as the military-industrial complex. He described further deeper cuts, should they occur, to the defense budget, again, as devastating. And he specifically talked about the critical need to sustain our investment in R&D to keep America's technological edge. I have to say, we were very pleased with the Secretary's commitment to sustaining the push on export control reform. America's ability to export is one of the very bright spots in what's otherwise a tough fiscal picture. His focus on what this means to our allies in the war on terror, as well as the overall health of our industry, was very reassuring. For our campaign, our message to the American people is quite simple. Contact your elected representatives and ask the same question. Why are we considering further cuts to the defense budget critical to both our national security and critical to 2.9 million American families? We know what it takes to keep our troops supplied, to give them total knowledge of the battlefield, and to dominate the skies, and make sure they succeed and come home safely. That's what our technology is there for. We have their back. We know the gains that America has seen from space exploration, spin-off industries like GPS and advanced medicine. We know the value of civil aviation, one of the most successful U.S. export industries and one with huge prospects for growth. And we know that the budget choices here in Washington could very well impact all of that. That's why we're launching the Second to None campaign. The issue of the budget is the foremost question before the Congress and the administration today. But the budget debate has been too fuzzy and abstract. Huge numbers for cuts are being tossed around, and there's not enough discussion of the real costs of those cuts, the impact on our national security, our economy, our industrial base, our civil and space industries. The debate has been marred by a lot of misconceptions. People assume the military can absorb these cuts. They don't realize that spending is at a historical low as a share of the budget. It's around 19% compared to a post-Vietnam average of 21%. People assume that budget cuts won't undermine our security. After all, we're drawing down in the Middle East. But what they don't realize is that savings from troop withdrawals will take years to realize, while the budget law, it requires immediate cuts to our national security that will decimate R&D and investment. So we want to make sure that people have the facts. So what exactly does the campaign entail? AIA and its member companies will speak out wherever we can, on the opinion pages, on television, radio, congressional events, anywhere there's someone who'll listen. We've launched the campaign website, www.secondtonone.org, and it's a site that we think will be a real focal point for this effort. People who want to learn about these issues and get more information can go there, and they can use the site to communicate directly with their representative in Congress. We're using social media. Not easy for a 91-year-old trade association to do, I can tell you that, but we're getting there. In fact, you can follow us on Twitter, Second to None USA. This effort involves our members, big and small, and I want you to hear from them now. The largest prime contractors, the smallest suppliers, they've all got a voice in this. There's a risk of complacency on this, we fear. Americans assume our military streak will be there, we'll protect them, that we'll be the first to Mars, just like we're the first to the moon, that our air traffic control system will always just work, like our traffic lights and our highways do. This campaign's got to remind people that we have these things because prior generations invested in them. Our defense was built through boom times and through lean times. Our space program is the work of more than half a century. America is second to none in aerospace and defense because our choices were good ones that our leaders made, even in tough times, good times and bad times. And if we're going to stay second to none, it will be because we made wise choices now. Thank you, and now I'd like to turn to Jim Albaugh of Boeing and our chairman to give you a few more aspects of this.
Thank you, Marion, and good morning. You know, to me, aerospace really defined the 20th century. When you think about the things we did, you know, helping the Allied war effort, you know, building thousands of airplanes, you know, helping to put man on the moon, you know, changing the way people travel with commercial airplanes, you know, changing the way that we communicate with satellites. We really were second to none in the 20th century. And I think the question that we're faced today with is, will we be second to none in the 21st century? I mean, I really believe that aerospace and defense is at a crossroads. You look at the space programs that we have in the United States. For the first time since 1962, we do not have the ability to put a U.S. astronaut into space on an American rocket. Long time since we haven't been able to do that. Some good news released this morning a potential heavy launch program that NASA's talking about, and we're very gratified about that. But I think the question is, will we have the resolve to see it through? We've had several other programs that were aborted, as you know. On the commercial side, times are pretty good. We've got a backlog at Boeing of over 7 years of production. We think that over the next 20 years, there'll be a market for some 33,500 airplanes. But it's a market that is going to be crowded. In the future, it won't be just the United States and Europe competing for that marketplace. It'll also be the Brazilians, it'll be the Canadians, it'll be the Russians, and it'll be the Chinese. And we need to ensure that we have a level playing field on which to compete. In the area of defense, I have great fears about the industrial base. Right now, for the first time in over 100 years, we do not have an active design team working on a manned aircraft. The F-35 is in test. It's not in design. And the design teams are going away. And I think the big question is, at what period of time do you lose the capability to actually design airplanes? I can give you an example that's close to home for me, and that is the 787. One of the reasons that we had issues with that airplane was the fact that we hadn't designed an airplane since the 777, and we lost the ability to do design. To me, to be a viable contractor, you have to do R&D, you have to do detailed design, you have to transition detailed design into production, you need to do production, and then you need to support the products that are in the field. If you lose any point on that continuum, you will have a very difficult time reconstituting it. And right now, there are very few new starts and very few active design teams supporting our United States Department of Defense. If one looks at the prior cuts that we've seen, certainly in my lifetime, after the Vietnam War, we had dramatic cuts and we had a hollow force, a force that took over a decade to develop again. After the Cold War, after the Berlin Wall came down, we had dramatic cuts then, but it was a very different time than it is now. After the Cold War, all the equipment was new. F-16s were new, the F-15s were new, the B-1 was new, the Abrams tanks were new, and they took some 700,000 military personnel out of uniform. Today, Marion talked about our fighting 2 wars. I would submit we're fighting 3, Afghanistan, Iraq, and cyber. And we are not taking people out of uniform, and the equipment that we have is old and needs to be reset. So a different time. I'm concerned about the current situation. We're cutting $460 billion out of the defense budget. If you were to talk to any defense contractor today, they are all laying people off. And if we had additional cuts of $600 billion over the next 10 years, I would question whether or not we will have a fighting force that's capable or an industrial base left. One of the concerns that I have is that we will wake up some morning without addressing the industrial base issue and call for a capability and find that the contractors do not have the ability to provide that capability. In my mind, I think it's very ironic right now that there's not enough talk about the industrial base, and there needs to be more. It truly is the arsenal of freedom, and I think the first question we have to ask is it strategic to the defense of our country, and is it strategic to the economic viability of our country? And I believe the answer to that is yes. I know that the answer to that in the Pentagon is yes. I'm not sure what the answer is on Capitol Hill. I think we need to do some things that are big and bold in this country. Marion talked about the next generation air traffic control. We could spend several $billion, $30 billion on air traffic management, and what we would have would be a system that would make flying much more efficient. It would help with energy independence. It would help with the environment. It would create jobs now and forever. It would help our airlines be much more cost effective and make more money. It would create jobs there, and it would create jobs because it would build and buy more airplanes. I think second to none is an attempt to try to communicate with everybody on how important the aerospace industry is to our country. And not just to keep it free, but also its economic viability. These are high-paying jobs. These are jobs that have big multipliers. These are jobs that create exports that we can sell overseas and create more jobs in the United States. I look forward to the question and answer session. And with that, I'd like to introduce our Vice Chairman, Dave Hess, the President and CEO of Pratt & Whitney.
Thanks, Jim. We need a smaller chairman. National security is absolutely critical, but this campaign is about a lot more than just our national defense. We need to really consider our historic space program as well as commercial aviation in the United States. And let me start with space first. There's really no budget area where the kind of harm that can come from the budget gyrations that we've seen and been going through has greater or has a more immediate impact than in the area of space. These are typically long horizon programs that take years to execute and require absolutely stable funding. When the shuttle retired, we're now paying the Russians when they're able to fly about $60 million ahead to take our astronauts up to the International Space Station. Now, the unacceptability of this approach became very clear about a month ago when the Russian Progress supply mission failed and launches were put on hold, consequently ending, as Jim said, decades of the U.S. being able to put manned spaceflight into orbit and supply the ISS. When Apollo ended in 1975, the shuttle program was well underway. Now, so there may have been a gap in launches, but there was no gap in work to be done on the manned spaceflight program. People and all the intellectual capital that was working on Apollo naturally moved over to the shuttle program from one program to the next. But today, we have a gap in manned U.S. launches now that the shuttle program has ended. That's why we've seen post-shuttle hundreds of layoffs at Pratt & Whitney Rocketdyne as well as other companies across the industry, many members of Aerospace Industries Association. So across the industry and across the country, we've seen these kinds of workforce reductions. This morning, NASA and the administration are announcing a new space launch system, as Jim talked about. This is encouraging, but as Jim alluded to, it's by no means secures our future in space. In this austere budgetary environment, we must be committed to a stable and secure funding that will endure through changes in administration and changes in Congress. Everything that Jim talked about with a risk to our defense base is even more true for American space workforce. This tremendous intellectual capital that took us decades to develop and took us to the moon and back, once it's dissolved, it will be extremely hard to reconstitute if and when we should decide to return to space. Now, Jim and I and many others in the aerospace industry today were inspired as children to join the industry by the U.S. space program. We need to inspire the next generation of children to take up careers in math, science, technology, and engineering to accomplish the next great goal for the United States. There are similar risks with other programs that are up in front of Congress right now. The House looks ready to kill the Webb telescope, even though its components are about 75% completed. It's hard to understand why we waste years of investment for short-term, relatively small budget savings. Satellite funding is another area at risk, as Marion talked about. Funding cuts are being considered that would imperil the polar orbits needed to extend our weather forecasting window and avoid a forecast gap by 2016. Now, Hurricane Irene did damage somewhere on the order of about $7 to $10 billion, even with multiple days of advance warning because of the capability we have. It's hard to imagine what the damages would have been had we not had the capability and without maintaining that capability going forward. It's examples like these that people need to appreciate and that the Second to None campaign will bring to the forefront for debate. The campaign will also educate people how much we have to gain by investing in civil aviation as well. The superhighway project that was launched under the Eisenhower administration resulted in a huge economic boom to the United States. I mean, if you think about the number of jobs that were created, not only with the construction of the highways and the transportation system itself, but everything that it contributed to, more efficiently linking cities across the United States, the productivity benefit that it had to our economy, the development of hotels, restaurants, all the cars that were sold that created jobs to fill up those highways. Well, the perfect analogy is a similar boom that could be triggered by the modernization of the air traffic control system, which is basically our highway for air travel. what it could do for the U.S., again, just as the Eisenhower administration highway system did back then. The next generation air traffic control system would bring an infrastructure into the 21st century, replacing 60 air radios and radars with modern GPS and data links. The next-gen air traffic control system would make air travel cheaper, faster, greener, and safer. A study that we recently had done by Deloitte indicated that completing the next-gen by 2025 would bring nearly $300 billion in net benefit to the U.S. economy, increase the number of flights by about 20%, and at the same time cut fuel burn and consequently CO2 emissions by about 12%. So it's a win-win-win all the way around. Next to None campaign ends to shine a spotlight on these kinds of issues and opportunities like these that need to be considered as we head into the budget debate that's ahead. Now it's my great pleasure to introduce our other three speakers from our mid-sized aerospace companies, Dawne, Chuck, and Rick, to talk with you more about our campaign. Thank you.
CEO of RTI International Metals. We're a titanium manufacturer, and we start and make titanium mill products all the way through advanced titanium fabricated parts and components, not only for the aerospace and defense, but also for the energy and medical industries. We have approximately just a little over 1,500 employees, $500 million in annual revenue, and we're located globally, but here in this country we have facilities in 7 states. From Connecticut to Virginia to Ohio, Pennsylvania, Missouri, Texas, and California. 40% of our business is defense. And we've been supporting the defense industry for 60 years. It's our titanium that sits in the SR-71 Blackbird that hangs over in the Edvar Hazy Museum. But it's also our titanium that you'll see in every fighter plane that's in the skies today, protecting this country now and for our future. And when we speak to jobs, we're talking about manufacturing jobs. These are folks that work in our mills and manufacture, fabricate, and machine products. We, in the last 4 years, to support the industry, we expanded and authorized over $600 million in capital expansions. We upgraded and expanded 2 of our facilities in the Ohio, Pennsylvania, and Missouri regions. But we also had to cancel a major project that would have added 300 jobs. It was a $300 million plant expansion as a result of not only the global recession, but the uncertainty of what's been happening. And another facility that's underway in Virginia has been delayed. We've been hoping to add additional jobs into the economy, but that delay has been impacted by what's going on. It's a facility that will support not only commercial aerospace programs, but also the defense programs. But I just wanted to make maybe one brief comment, echoing something that Jim Albaugh said about our industrial base. You know, RTI International Metals has been part of that industrial base, one of the 30,000 suppliers that Marion mentioned earlier. But we too have research and technology and new innovation programs that are in jeopardy. And it's that research that really is what you need for the future, and it's the future we're talking about. From metallurgical alloys and new alloy development, that's something that we've had to put on hold. It doesn't take place. You don't have the same skills. You won't find the same metallurgist tomorrow. That's the fear we have. And I'll just give one example. In the start of the Iraq War, you may recall there was a lot of discussion about our troops and the protection they needed and whether they had the right armor when you had the new IEDs and a new type of warfare. Well, it was our company that was approached by the Army. Working in our research department in Ohio with our technologists and our metallurgists, we worked on a new ballistic titanium armor. We melted that new sheet in our facilities here in this country, and we shipped it right into Iraq, where they up-armored the Stryker around the turret to protect the gunners in theater. That's the kind of technology and research we worry about having when we talk about our industrial base. Thanks. Chuck?
Thank you. Good morning. I'm Chuck Gray, the Vice President and Chief Operating Officer for a small woman-owned family business in Stillwater, Oklahoma. We employ 150 technical and engineering professionals. Our payroll is $10 million a year, so if you do the math, Those jobs are worth about $65,000 apiece a year, annual salary. We take ranch hands and farmers from the field, provide them technical training so they can assemble sophisticated electronics for satellites, for aircraft cockpit displays, for test and simulation systems, for unmanned aerospace vehicles, and missile technology circuitry. The second to none campaign is essential from our perspective. There are over 30,000 suppliers. I represent the suppliers from the Supplier Management Council on the AII XCOM. And the suppliers have similar stories to what I'm portraying now. They have niche technologies. For example, one of the niche technologies we bring is a system that is able to translate radar, video, and other sensor signals on board Navy ships and collate and distribute that information so the captain on the bridge has the essentials to navigate and to detect targets. Small businesses bring innovation, passion, and a sense for the constitutional responsibility that says provide for the common defense. We've been impacted like Dawne's company has in cancellations, the cancellation of the Consolidation program, the cancellation of the NPOS satellite program, and the delay in funding shipboard programs that will modernize their capability to navigate and identify targets in hostile environments has impacted our business. We would like to hire more people. The challenge we have right now is the uncertainty of the budget environment. We understand that the nation has to balance its books, but we've already given it the office. And that uncertainty is impacting our capital investment decisions, which tear down jobs to other sectors of the supply chain. So the bottom line is businesses like ours and many of the other 30,000 suppliers are advocating the Second to None campaign to make sure that we are able to shake the hand of Medal of Honor winners, like I had the opportunity to do yesterday on Capitol Hill, Sergeant Perez. That's what it's all about, to protect our warfighters, to make sure that they have the resources so they can come home and enjoy their families.
Good morning. My name is Rick McNeel. I'm Chairman and CEO of Lord Corporation, a privately held company that manufactures parts for aerospace and defense, focused on noise and vibration control. I'm here on behalf of manufacturers like Lord and small businesses that are critical to the aerospace supply chain. Businesses like ours will be seriously impacted by ill-advised cuts to our nation's defense, to say nothing of the impact on national security. Let me talk just a moment about Lord Corporation. Lord generates $800 million in annual revenue, employs 2,700 people in 24 countries, focused on 5 U.S. states. 70% of our production and 50% of our sales are in the United States. Annually, we invest 10% of total sales, or roughly $80 million in research and development, and 85% of this amount is invested domestically. All of our aerospace parts are manufactured in plants we operate in Pennsylvania and Ohio. Collectively, we employ 1,300 individuals across these facilities, largely focused on serving our aerospace and defense customers. In just these 2 states, we have 151 aerospace suppliers, creating an additional $45 million in annual economic activity and supporting countless additional jobs. We're on several key platforms, including the V-22 Osprey, the Black Hawk, the Apache, the Chinook, the Joint Strike Fighter, the C-130, and other military aircraft, as well as most commercial airplanes and helicopters. Underscoring points made earlier by Jim and Marion, the aerospace industry is a national asset that has been developed over decades of investment and constant improvement. We truly are second to none in aerospace. But the additional cuts in defense spending being contemplated by the administration and the Congress put our preeminent position at risk. Companies like Lord and the supply chain we depend on can't simply turn off and on our design, innovation, and production capacity depending on the latest short-term thinking in Washington. We spent 9 years developing the key feature of the F-35B. We have more than 20 years of investment in the V-22, and we're just one supplier. Our country's fiscal problems demand a long-term solution. I'm here to communicate to our lawmakers that additional defense cuts seriously undermine the competitive advantage that we've created over the past century. It would also jeopardize tens of thousands of jobs at a time when our sustained unemployment is at record high levels. That is why Lord Corporation believes that the Second to None campaign is so important. We will be reaching out into our communities and our supply chain to mobilize our collective voices and explain to our elected officials what's at stake. We had meetings on the Hill yesterday, and after this meeting we'll have a meeting with Senator Toomey, who, as you know, sits on the Super Committee and represents Lord in Pennsylvania. We plan to keep our efforts like this up and to encourage others in our industry and community to make sure Washington knows how we feel. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Let's go to questions if we could.
Just a moment, please. Is this on? Yes. Okay. If you could hold your questions until I get you, just as a courtesy to those who are being taped.
Okay. All right. No, that's fine, Dad. I'm sorry? Okay. All right. Roxanne.
Thank you. Roxana Tehran with Bloomberg News. I was wondering if now is the time for the industry that's been, like Mr. McNeel said, dependent on the government's short-term or long-term thinking. Is now the time for the defense industry to find a more creative approach to sustaining the jobs and not be as dependent on government funding? And are you considering any new approaches to this?
Well, I think I'll try to talk to that if I could. I don't think that any of us are asking the Department of Defense to build products that they don't need. But I think if you were to go and talk to the people in the Pentagon, they would tell you that another $600 million of cuts would be draconian, and it would impact their ability to do their mission, and it would cripple the industrial base that we have. I talked about the continuum that it takes to be a prime contractor, development, transition, and manufacturing. We know we're not going to have a lot of new starts, but there's no reason why there couldn't be small investments to keep design teams together. So if and when there are new development programs, we have people that understand how to do R&D and development. I'm very excited about the prospect of working with the Department of Defense to figure out what a industrial policy might look like. And I think from that we can figure out a way with this reduced budget that we have to keep many of the requirements viable as we go forward. As I mentioned earlier, we need to identify what those critical technologies are. We need to identify what the threats are. We need to identify technologies that we need to keep mature in order to address those threats if and when they become real, or if and when we have the budget to be able to address them.
All right. Down here in front, and if we could bring the mic there, that would help.
Hi, Steve Trumbull with Flight Global and Flight International magazine. What does second to none look like? Are you asking simply to avoid the $600 billion cut? Do you need to reverse the $460 billion that has already been enacted or proposed? And secondly, it was only a few months ago that Ashton Carter talked about the financial health of this industry, of the defense industry, and said it was better than it has ever been, and that the companies are sitting on $50 billion in cash. And today we hear that it's actually fragile and that 2.9 million jobs are at risk. Is that financial picture inaccurate, and how is it inaccurate?
Let me make a general comment, and then I'll turn to others here on this. I think, number one, we are asking that everyone with the Second to None campaign understand the deep risk to our national security and our economy by applying these kinds of cuts, even the initial, and it's a big number, 460 to 480, against our R&D and our investments in future technology. There are many decisions to be made within those broad numbers as to how, if those numbers are accepted, how they will then be applied. And we want it very clear that you cannot assume that the defense industrial base will be there if, in fact, there is no investment in R&D and there is no investment going forward, or no significant investment going forward in acquisitions and new programs. I think I will turn to others on the issue of the company's equity position, but I think it's important to note that the companies have downsized and leaned out tremendously in this environment and anticipating this environment, and there have been numbers of significant layoffs within our major companies already. So we have certainly pulled back at this point to try to be right-sized and well-positioned to be able to move through what everyone acknowledges is a difficult period.
Yeah, we need to be careful we don't confuse the financial health of a company with the viability of a company to do new programs. And I know I'm a little bit redundant here, but there are a number of corporations that are building airplanes for the Department of Defense. That doesn't mean that they have the capability to develop a new airplane if called upon to do it. And again, I get back to the continuum that you have to have in place to be a viable contractor. While it's true that over the last decade, companies have done well financially, and you can go and you can check the quarterly earnings on that. But our big fear is, when called upon in future years, will we have the capability to develop for our country the needs that they have to address the threats that are out there?
I would just add to that, investing in an uncertain environment, equity that is on hand, is something that very few boards of directors and very few shareholders groups would accept. You have to understand that there are many options for those kinds of investments, and they do not necessarily go to aerospace and defense. These companies have very real diversification these days, and it can also go elsewhere. Question here.
John Bennett from The Hill. Can you walk us through, there seem to be new numbers every day. You mentioned 460 to 480 billion. Can you walk me through how you arrived at that number? And my second question is, I've heard Toomey's name, McKeon's name. Are you also meeting with Democratic members of the super committee, maybe to try to change some minds and inform them of what, along the same lines where you've said here?
Just on that last, the answer is absolutely yes. In fact, we met with Representative Clyburn just yesterday as another. It's hard to tick off all of the members that we're engaging with, but the answer is certainly we want to talk with both sides of the aisle because they're both having to make tough decisions. In terms of numbers, you're asking a good question because there are a lot of numbers floating out there. The 350 was the number that was put forward in the Budget Control Act. That number, however, was not specific as to what base it was being taken against, number one. And number two, there have already been decisions in the Pentagon to draw down the accounts in the Pentagon by some $78 million that Gates had already put on the table as a true cut. You remember there was $100 million before that was to be reinvested. So those are the roll-ups that are going on, but I think it is true that it's a range there because of the factors that I just mentioned.
Hi, Megan Megan Scully with National Journal. Wanted to follow up with another super committee question. A lot of these decisions will be up to the 12 members on the panel, and there aren't a lot of what you would consider traditional defense hawks on the committee, aside from Senator Kyle. Wanted to see what kind of reception you're getting to these arguments as you meet with members, and whether you feel like you're facing an uphill battle here politically, or are you optimistic about your campaign and the message that you're putting out on Capitol Hill?
Anyone want to take that one? Well, let me say from my observation, because I have met with a number of these members over time, although the super committee specifically, as you know, since it's just been named and we were in a recess period, we have not met with this many of them specifically since they were named. But I think it's fair to say that in this discussion, everyone does understand that a foremost constitutional requirement is to preserve and protect our national defense for the country. So I think they take that very seriously. The problem, of course, is that there are other kinds of cuts that are extremely unpalatable. And historically, when we have faced these kinds of downturns before, the defense industry, the Pentagon's budget, has been an area that has been hit very hard. So in these discussions, we're trying to make sure that they understand that if you go into that trough and you go deep down like we did back in the 90s, it is extremely expensive to climb back up, and sometime you find you do not have the technologies there to do it. So that's the discussion we're having, and I will tell you, people are listening very closely. Most of them have very strong financial backgrounds, and I think that also plays into it when you're talking about investments.
You know, I remember in the early 90s when there were the large defense cuts. I was working out in the Los Angeles area, and you had Northrop, you had Lockheed, you had North American Rockwell, you had many different companies. And I remember when the cuts came, reading an editorial in the Los Angeles Times, and it said that we have a very diversified economy in Southern California, and these defense cuts will not impact the viability of the market there. It did. It had a huge impact, and it really took about a dozen years for the economy of Southern California to come back with all those cuts that were made. I think it's worthwhile to point out that we think if there was a cut of another $600 billion over the next 10 years, that it could add a percentage point to the unemployment in this country. And yeah, that number is probably not precise, but it's about what we calculate in AIA, and it's also pretty close to what I think the Department of Defense has calculated as well.
Over here.
Colin Clark, AOL Defense. The American public over the last 10 years have seen enormous amounts of cash flow into your companies, and there's clearly a general feeling among the public that you've done very, very well, and that now that we're coming home, the money can be cut and it won't have that much effect. There are very few Americans who actually serve in the military. There's an enormous disconnect between the American public and what you guys do. How are you going to bridge that gap? How are you going to engage them and actually get them to listen outside of the Beltway?
Well, we do believe that when you talk about the fundamentals, that we are in a very dangerous world. There is no peace dividend. We are not out of these wars, and there are other conflicts and other demands in a world that's fraught with terrorism that does not give us circumstances like we might have had in the past. So I think that they do need to recognize that, and most people in the public, when you talk in those terms, they do get it, and they do believe it is very important for our all-volunteer Army to have the best we can offer in technology, and that does mean ongoing innovation and ongoing development of new technologies. No one elsewhere is standing still, and on the cybersecurity front as well as on the more traditional weapons arena. On top of that, I think it's important to also say that you can look at the health of companies in a number of ways. Certainly cash on hand is something that is one measure. Stock price is another. Our stock price, I don't think anyone would say we have large and grandiose stock prices. And our profit margins, when you compare them to other industries, particularly in manufacturing, but certainly in the high-tech arena, are relatively modest compared to other industries. So this is not an arena where we have tremendously prosperous and overly wealthy companies. This is a group of hardworking companies that have already had to do a great deal of downsizing and layoffs, and they're trying to preserve the capability that Americans count on. And that's what we want people to understand, is you cannot take that for granted.
If I might have a comment from the supplier perspective, we've seen in our supply base, which is about 200 people, about 10% of them have gone out of business over the last couple of years just based on economic situations. So the health of the supply base, as Jim Albaugh said, is really in question. And these niche technologies that will ensure we're able to build the next trainer or the next bomber or the next submarine are something that really need to be examined in depth.
I guess I'd add to that as well. I mean, if you look at the pattern of defense spending over the years, I mean, during the Eisenhower administration, we spent about 10% of GDP on defense. Under the Reagan administration, that number dropped to about 6% of GDP, and today we're somewhere around 4% of GDP spending. So there's been a continual reduction in spending on defense. Along with that, what you've seen is a tremendous consolidation of the defense industry. In 1990, if you look at about the 130 largest companies in the aerospace industry, those 130 companies have now roughly consolidated into about 7 companies. And along with that consolidation, they've taken out their redundancy, closed facilities, had to consolidate operations, things to try to improve efficiency and productivity, and also make adjustments for the significant reductions in defense spending. We're now to a point where, rather than having maybe 4 or 5 or 6 suppliers that might have a technical capability, such as you heard Dawne and Rick and Chuck talk about, there might be one, maybe 2 or 1 supplier today that has that capability. If they elect to go and pursue other markets because the defense industry is just not viable going forward, we're going to lose that capability altogether. I mean, we've shrunk to the point where now there's little margin in some of these key technologies and capabilities that exist today. You know, Jim, I think, talked about the fact that we have 1 new program in development today with the Joint Strike Fighter program. First time in history that we haven't had a new start on any kind of new program in defense, on a helicopter or some kind of fixed-wing program. As that capability atrophies, it's very hard to reconstitute and get it back. So, I mean, this is not a discussion about commercial viability of the companies involved here. It's, as Jim pointed out, it's really a discussion about being able to maintain the industrial base that's absolutely critical to our national security.
Over here. Sorry, Dan, making you work. Right over here.
Hi, I'm Theo Emery with Boston Globe. I have two-pronged question. The first one is, what's the total, I guess, dollar amount to this campaign overall? And then the second question is this: there's obviously been a lot of criticism of the rush to lobby the super committee and to ensure that various sectors, various industries aren't cut. And so how would you respond to the I mean, obviously the aerospace industry has been well-funded for many, many years, many decades. So how would you respond to the criticism of efforts such as yours to get the attention of super committee members? I mean, you've obviously are making no bones about the ones that you've already met with and are going to meet with. So what about that criticism?
Well, to begin with, the campaign is one that the companies are all contributing to, and there's a lot of sweat equity in that, a lot of contributed manpower, so I really can't give you a figure. And we're not out there on the airwaves doing high-powered, glitzy advertising, as I said earlier. We're really trying to have a serious dialogue, a lot of it through the media as well as in direct discussions, to educate people, to inform them what these choices really are all about. We think that is the responsible thing for companies of our stripe that are so vital from both an economic and a military standpoint to do. That sitting back and not putting forward that these are real choices, very tough choices, and they have impact for our country's future in a way that is rarely considered fully. We think that is the responsible, right thing to do as corporate citizens. I can't give you an exact dollar amount. We really haven't rolled it up that way.
I mean, a lot of the work that's going to be done as part of this campaign, and to address the question earlier, is really through our member companies. If you look at the companies that constitute AIA, we've got about 350 aerospace companies, representing the 30,000 suppliers we talked about that work in this industry across the United States. And these aren't all big companies like Boeing or United Technologies. These are companies that are in cities and towns across the United States. These are Main Street kind of companies like Dawne and Rick and Chuck represent great companies, smaller companies like RTI, like Frontier, like Lord, that really make up the industrial base that we're talking about. So this is not just about some of the big names that you've heard historically. These are about jobs and companies that are in every city and town across the United States that really make up the fabric of the industry. And we're going to use those businesses and those members of AIA to help get the message outside of the Beltway to the local constituencies to help them understand what's at risk here.
Yeah, if I might, Marion, this is companies like ours. I think there was a question earlier that said the general public doesn't necessarily know and appreciate what defense impacts have on employment to companies other than Boeing or Pratt & Whitney, but to a company like RTI International Metals, where 40% of the business is defense-related. That's real jobs in Ohio, Pennsylvania, Virginia. And we're going to be taking that to make sure we inform the local congresspersons, too.
The same is true for Lord Corporation, and my biggest area of concern is in research and development. Already we're seeing significant cuts on programs that we've already invested heavily in, and now we're not sure whether the funding is going to be there or not. And we've already made some layoffs in that area.
I think to an extent this is really a referendum, and not to be too black and white about it, but is a healthy industrial base critical to the security of the United States of America and the economic viability of our country? I think that's a question the super committee has to answer.
Back in the back, if we could.
Hi, thanks. Rachel Martin with National Public Radio. Forgive me if you mentioned this, but Mr. McNeel, Mr. Gray, and Ms. Hickton, have you suffered any layoffs over the past year? If so, what are the numbers on that? And then for Mr. Albaugh and Mr. Hess, you both talked about the atrophy that the industry could suffer in the creative part of what you do. How do you forget how to build an airplane? Break it down for me. How does that go away over time? Thanks.
Maybe I'll start. Within our industry, because 70% of what we do is aerospace, we're in a very cyclical industry, and I can tell you the last 3 years it was not pleasant being in our industry. We had, not only did we lay off employees, we tried to minimize it, but instead of laying off, this was one of the first times within our particular company and industry, we chose to reduce the workforce by cutting back people's hours, but keeping them employed so that they could maintain some employment. We also cut pay. We stopped bonuses, including all the way up at the top, starting with the executives, cutting the pay, freezing salaries, cutting bonuses. We revamped our entire health care program. We had a very generous health care program before the revisions, and we made major changes to that and pushed that down into more of a sharing with the workforce. So yes, and as I mentioned, we had an entire plant that we had started construction on, and we had to write off over $70 million in money spent. So yes, we have been impacted by the global recession, and we would expect to continue to be impacted. But again, I echo what Jim said earlier. This is really for us about a future. Are we looking at the future of an industrial base, and what are we thinking about strategically on how we're going to protect national security going forward?
I will add that we've laid off about a small amount, 4% of our employees, but the reason that we've only laid off 4% of our employees is we've been able to offset that with some international sales. So export control reform is a big issue that needs to be addressed. After this initial international sale that we have a large engineering design team that designs some very specialized electronics, we're not sure. Right now we're at risk for another 20 to 25% of our employees that we have to make a decision on by the end of the year.
I think designing an airplane is one of the most difficult tasks there is. It's complex, large-scale systems integration at its finest and hardest. You look at an airplane, you have to certify an airplane to 9 nines of reliability. You have to develop an airplane that can be built at rate. You have to design an airplane that can withstand 60 to 80,000 takeoffs and landings. You have to take disparate technology and integrate that together. And it's a very challenging systems engineering piece of work to do that. Once you have an airplane that's got an FAA certification, you don't change it. You might do incremental improvements, but it's sustaining engineering. And doing sustaining engineering is very different than development engineering, where you take the requirements, you decompose those down to the smallest element of work and the smallest piece part, and then you validate and verify that and build it up into the finished product. It's a very difficult thing to do. As I mentioned earlier, we had trouble on the 787 because we hadn't done a development program since the early 90s with the 777. We forgot how. We were too busy doing sustaining engineering. Again, it's a different skill set, and it's something you have to keep fresh and viable.
But it flows down to the supply chain. As simple as when we shut down one of our major manufacturing sites, you melt titanium at 4,000 degrees in a vacuum arc furnace. You shut that down because you're in the middle of a recession and we shut down a program. You don't turn a light switch on and turn it back on. It takes 6 to 9 months to get that equipment back up and running, and then every one of our customers has to come back in and recertify it for the quality specs. It's a process. You lose it, you don't get it back overnight.
In the example of Pratt Whitney, our Rocketdyne engine business is a 50-year-old business that really is. Every astronaut, U.S. astronaut who's gone into space has gone up on a Pratt Whitney Rocketdyne engine. And I must point out that we've had, by the way, 100% mission success with every one of our launches over that period of time. But it took 50 years really to develop the capability, the intellectual capital and technology that we have today. And every generation has learned from the last one behind it. We learned from Mercury, we applied that to Gemini, we applied that to Apollo, which eventually got us to the moon, and we took that learning and extended it to the shuttle program and continue. But in May of this year, with the shuttle program ending and no clear direction or vision beyond it, we started letting go hundreds of our engineers from Rocketdyne who had the knowledge, who worked on the Apollo programs, who will go off and retire or move into other industries or do other things. And over time, those reductions will have to continue unless there's something that succeeds the shuttle program. And looks like there's hope today. There's a new space launch system announcement going on as we speak right now. So I think, maybe there is a vision being brought forward that would allow us to kind of continue the great legacy that we have. But this is not something you go learn in school. You don't graduate from the university with the knowledge on how to develop a rocket engine. I mean, it's in the heads of people. It's in the knowledge that's compiled over a 30-year or 20-year career. And if those people go elsewhere, you lose that knowledge. And there's only one company in the United States that has the capability that we have. We're the world's leader in liquid rocket propulsion. The only person in the United States that can do what we do is Rocketdyne. And if Rocketdyne doesn't have that capability, you got to start to question the U.S.'s capability to develop new liquid rocket propulsion.
Question here.
Thanks. Jen DiMassio with the Aviation Week. I had a couple of questions, actually. One is, Mr. Albaugh, you met yesterday over at the Pentagon with Secretary Panetta, and you said that that you're looking forward to getting an industrial base policy. When are you next meeting to discuss that? What's sort of your next takeaway, and what do you hope to get from that? And then also a question on space. Mr. Hess, you mentioned that the cuts are actually more dramatic, but the space is not included in this sequester mechanism. So I was hoping you could walk me through what are the most devastating space cuts and where are they coming from? Is that just the House Appropriations, Mark, or is it broader than that?
Yeah, yesterday was a very good meeting. I think we had good alignment on the industrial base as an issue that needs to be addressed. We had alignment on things that we needed to do to have more efficiency in everything that we do in terms of defense programs. I think we had alignment on foreign military sales, export control, those issues. Relative to the next step, we're going to leave that to our customer, but we're looking forward to continuing the dialogue that started yesterday. And I think that the Pentagon feels as strongly about preserving the industrial base as we do.
I guess with respect to the uncertainty in the rocket engine business at Pratt Whitney, there was a replacement program for the shuttle program. It was called Constellation. The Constellation program was canceled, but really canceled without anything to succeed it. So there's really, since that time, there's been uncertainty in terms of the funding stream going forward. We've continued the development of the J2X engine that had been intended for Constellation, and we think it might have application to the new program that's being announced today. But there really lies the budget uncertainty. The program to replace shuttle was canceled with nothing to replace it, and it appears that maybe a replacement program is being brought forward today.
And certainly the budget allocations have come down for NASA very substantially. It depends on which one you're referring to, but we could get you good figures on that. Here.
Hi, Emily Rutherford, Defense Daily. You talked about asking people to reach out as part of the campaign to their representatives. Are you focusing on the members of the super committee, those districts there? Do you have local task force or a special emphasis on companies, people that you're asking to reach out who are in those districts?
We certainly are reaching out to the super committee now that they've been appointed. But at the end of the day, this is going to be a vote where every member of Congress's vote will count. These are tough choices, and we do believe this is something that will go, and it will be a very tough set of votes that members are going to be taking. So we're really reaching out to every member of Congress we possibly can, because again, 535 people are going to be making some tough decisions. Over here, Jonathan.
Hi, yes. John Crowley with Reuters. How much of this decision has been driven by your interaction with the super committee? And is this what is troubling you more, the situation at the Pentagon, or is it the situation on the Hill?
Well, I think it's fair to say that we made this decision to launch this campaign before there ever was a super committee, before the Budget Act was put in place, because the discussions on cuts and the discussions on our deficit and getting our financial house in order was all moving forward. So this has been something that our industry certainly took a serious look at and decided that we really needed to speak out well back further before any of that. The focus is certainly on the decision makers, both within the administration and on Capitol Hill. But much of the tough decisions right now will center on Capitol Hill, and I think we have to recognize that. We do want, though, to work closely with the Pentagon, because again, then within certain allocations, they're going to have to decide where some of those cuts are applied. Right here.
Thank you. Sandra Irwin with National Defense. Mr. Albaugh, you talked about the United States not having a program for manned aviation for the first time. To what extent is that really a budget problem, or is it a problem of the Department of Defense maybe not really knowing what they want? They seem to be struggling with requirements for a lot of their long-term programs like the bomber and the air-sea battle. So maybe that is really the issue, that they're not clear on what they want, and how long maybe can the Department of Defense believe they can wait before they can make up their mind?
Yeah. Well, I think we need to separate those two issues. You have the Department of Defense and their focus on the military and the weapon systems that they need, and then you have NASA, who is responsible for human spaceflight. I think at some point in time we forgot about how important the space program is. One, it's a great dream and it's a great motivator for people going into science and engineering. Two, I think there's so many technology spin-offs that come from human spaceflight. I think the third thing is, along with the spin-offs, come technologies that can be flowed into the Department of Defense, and there are many examples, of that. But I think that if I had to put my finger on what happened, Mike Griffin, the NASA administrator under the last administration, wanted to park the shuttle. And he wanted to park the shuttle because he wanted to have dollars available to support the next human spaceflight program. And what happened was we parked the shuttle, but the money that was freed up from parking the shuttle was not used for a human spaceflight program. Constellation was canceled. And only now are we seeing NASA determine what their next mission might be. And again, I wasn't at the press conference at 10 o'clock this morning, but I'm very hopeful that what they're talking about is a program to help us go back to the moon and go back to Mars. Going to space is a very difficult thing to do. Only 3 countries have done it. And, I hope that, we are the next country to set foot on the moon. I fear that we won't be, though.
What about DoD?
Well, DoD has not had a human spaceflight program. I think what's happening here, the super committee is going to look at budget cuts without the Pentagon having done the evaluation of what those impacts might be. And to me, the threat environment, the security environment, and the capabilities that are necessary to defend this country ought to drive the budget process, as opposed to the budget process, driving what we can afford. And that's what I think is happening right now.
I think a prime example, if you look at the tanker program, I mean, the DoD has been very clear for years that they've needed a new tanker to replace the Eisenhower-era tanker that is, rapidly in need of replacement. It took us 10 years to get that program launched because of various reasons, but it wasn't because of lack of direction or an understanding from the DoD as to what the need or the requirement was. And we can't let those kinds of things happen again.
I'll take another couple of questions, and then we should be wrapping up. Back here in the back.
Eric Lischblau with the New York Times. Who else besides Toomey and Clyburn have you already met with on the super committee? And in the meetings you've had so far, have you talked about specific numbers, dollar figures, that you think the industry could absorb, if not $460, $480 billion? What is your target for what would be a realistic cut, assuming that there are going to be significant cuts all around?
On the question of the super committee, again, it's just been named and they've just been back in town. So I think we have another meeting lined up tomorrow. I'll have to check on that. Be happy to give you any names as they go forward. But we have certainly met with some of these people in the past. Senator Collins just as one of the examples. Senator Murray is another. Senator Murray chairs the Senate Aerospace Caucus and has been a very thoughtful member of the community that understands the capabilities and the importance of aerospace and defense. So there's a lot of examples. I'm sorry, the second part of your question. Our position is no more. No more. We do believe that at this point, with the kind of cut that has already been tabled through the Budget Control Act, that defense has been cut into the bone, and we cannot have that continue. So we are there already, and we feel very strongly that there needs to be great attention given to the investments also in the next-gen system for FAA and in NASA and human spaceflight. So we've got a broad agenda here that goes beyond just those cuts. But as far as defense is concerned, the cuts have been taken that could be, possibly can be absorbed, and it is into the bone. Over here.
I'm just curious, the pro-defense, the defense establishment, by taking a position of no further defense cuts, instead of, you know, setting a target like, say, maybe 150, I'm just throwing out a number, more, to avoid the trigger, do you run the risk of hurdling the process by taking such a hard line toward the trigger even faster, almost inevitable?
The Super Committee has a lot of choices. They have some things that they need to look at that are very fundamental to addressing the deficit. You could do away with the entire defense budget and you would not have addressed the deficit and debt problem of this country, and I think everyone knows that. So continuing to raid the defense coffers, which were not the source of the problem to begin with, does not make sense, and I think that is our view. They have a number of areas that they need to look at. And certainly avoiding the sequester should be a fundamental goal of that committee. From what we have heard from members of the committee, it is. I think they see that as the true abyss that they are not willing to hurl the country into. Over here. Sorry, Dan, I'm just...
Otto Kreischer with National Journal Daily and others. We've been focusing on industrial base. But there's another concern the nation has that's losing its scientific engineering edge. STEM, you folks have been big on STEM, promoting STEM. You'll talk about the impact that these budget cuts in NASA and defense will have on that. And the other one is on space. You've also focused on NASA cutting back, but there's been a big push for commercial space. You folks have been, commercial industry wants to take the replacement for the shuttle to take things to the space station and things like that. How will that be affected? The commercial space push, how will that be affected by these other cuts? Does that give them more advantage, or does it hurt them as well?
Well, on the latter point, we're dealing with a shrinking pie at NASA, and that does affect all aspects of our space capabilities. Certainly, we are supportive of developing a healthy commercial space industry that can service the shuttle and that can perform both crew and cargo launch for the near space arena, low Earth orbit. But what we're talking about here, when we're talking about capabilities such as Rocketdyne, we're talking about the outer space arena. We're talking about where man has not gone. And that ties right into your concern about STEM, because it is the inspiration that comes from that kind of exploration, which this country has been known for since its very beginning, that does inspire a lot of young people to go into the fields of science, technology, engineering, and math, to be willing to see themselves as having a career that's truly important, because it does go where man hasn't gone before. It does provide that kind of innovation, the new emerging technologies that the space program has been known for. Young people, as they look at their prospects, if they see no momentum in NASA and in our space programs, will certainly hold back and will look elsewhere. When they see the defense industry going into a downturn and they do not see prospects for new programs and new designs, there are a lot of other options, and they will certainly veer into other fields, and that will be a grave loss for an industry that has a very graying population.
You know, it used to be the best and the brightest from around the world came to the United States, were educated and stayed. Now the best and the brightest come, get educated, and leave and compete against us. Technology drives half of our GDP. It used to be we were a net exporter of technology. Now we're a net importer of technology. I think Marion, hit it on the head. It's not investing money in STEM. That's important. We need to do that. But I think it's also important that this country does great things, that it inspires the young people to want to be scientists and engineers. I mean, going to the moon was a great thing to do. And we talked about the interstate highway system. David talked about that. That was a great thing. Winning the Cold War without firing a shot was a great thing. But I can't think of too many great things we're trying to do in this country right now which will inspire kids to want to get into STEM. And there's not a lot out there for kids who want to get into the space program or want to get into aerospace. I have real concerns about our ability to attract the talent that we need to maintain the leadership position that we have in aerospace.
One more. All right, and I think you haven't had a question, so last question.
Hi there, Gabe Starosta, Inside Defense. You all have spoken obviously against more additional cuts from the defense budget, but today you've also talked a little bit about the need for investment in air traffic modernization, infrastructure, that kind of thing. I believe, Mr. Hess, you mentioned $30 billion. Do you think that's a proposal that could pass through this Congress where investment spending and stimulus spending has really gotten a bad name?
We would hope so. I mean, the benefit to the economy, I think, is enormous. You heard the numbers that I quoted. I mean, the productivity benefit, I mean, we've estimated about $40 billion in lost productivities from the inefficiencies of the system today. If you look at the benefits, I talked about, the fact that we estimate there would be 20% increase in flights as a result of a modernized air traffic control system. And at the same time, we'd have reductions in CO2 emissions and fuel burn because of the more efficient flight paths that would be enabled by a modernized air traffic control system. So in effect, again, you're creating the superhighway of the skies with this new modernized air traffic control systems. I think it is, you could argue it is a great form of stimulus for the economy.
And with that, we want to thank you all for coming. We appreciate your attention to an important issue. Thank you again.
Certainly.